Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants Europe to make its own army to help fight Russia. The US is looking less likely to support the continent following its talks with the Russians. But with countries like Poland and the Czech Republic against the idea, is an EU army even possible? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the idea of a European army is not new, but since the war in Ukraine, discussions have intensified. The UK, France and Sweden are all willing to send troops to Ukraine, but other EU nations are less convinced. So, can Europe pull together a military force?
Ukraine may no longer be able to count on its biggest supporter in its fight against Russia, the US. As US and Russian relations tighten following the two countries' peace talks that excluded Europe. Instead, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants Europe to make a European army to support Ukraine. European leaders held emergency peace talks last week, calling for the continent to ramp up its defence capabilities. However, the leaders were split on the idea of sending troops. The UK, Sweden and Germany said they were open to sending peacekeeper troops to Ukraine.
Europe must play its role, and I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement.
While Poland is against the idea, the Czech Republic, who are not at the talks, also remain against it. Vice President of the European Commission agrees.
We do not need a European army. We need 27 European armies that are capable and can effectively work together to deter our rivals and defend Europe.
But Poland recognises the need for investment in European defence, which has been underfunded for decades.
We must always invest and remember that Putin or another dictator may come and threaten our security. It never ends.
The idea of an EU army has been discussed since the 1950s. Is 2025 the year it will finally come true?
Well, let's meet our guests in Geneva. We have Gunilla von Hall. She is Foreign Affairs Correspondent. That's at the Swedish daily newspaper Svenska Dagbladet. In Edinburgh, in Scotland, we have Stuart Crawford. He's a retired Lieutenant Colonel and Defence Analyst. And here with me in the studio, I'm delighted to say we've Paul Ingram from the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Stuart, to you first. How would this European army work? And more importantly, I guess, who's going to pay for it?
Two very good questions. I think that the background to the renewed discussion about a European army is clearly Donald Trump and his administration signalling that Europe can no longer rely, perhaps as once we did, on the USA to bail us out in military terms. And so it makes absolute sense for Europe to consider how it might organize its collective defense in the absence of the USA, and also possibly Canada, which is also part of NATO, as most people will know. It would work by consensus. And it wouldn't mean a standing army, I don't think, somewhere stationed in the middle of Europe, but it would need a headquarters which was well-practiced, well-rehearsed, multinational, and also troops which perhaps rotated in and out during the exercise season so that all the nations which might come to be part of this to be well-practiced working with each other. And I include air forces and navies in that as well.
Gunilla, to you, your country, Sweden, is one of the very few in Europe in favour of helping out with troop numbers. What's the feeling like amongst the Swedish public?
Well, I would say the political appetite for sending troops to Ukraine or countries bordering Ukraine is very big, but the public appetite is maybe less firm, less convinced. Our Prime Minister today said again that we have to be firm, we have to support Ukraine. If necessary, we will go with troops. And as we know, France has also been enthusiastic about this. The UK have said too, we can send troops if necessary, ground troops. And Sweden is there too. We have these three countries, but apart from them, Germany have said that, it's premature to speak about any troops on the ground. Poland have said too, no, we're not willing to do this. We're protecting the eastern flank of NATO, that is our own territory. So far, three countries. It's quite weak, but probably more countries will come, depending what this army is going to look like. What are we talking about? It's very vague today. And the only thing that seems to be clear, it's not going to be peacekeeping troops or peacekeeping force, because that's more under the UN umbrella. And then you need to be on both sides on the line of contact. And we know what happened in Bosnia in 1995, when 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed by the Serbs.
Thank you, Gunilla.
It was not, then it showed it's not so, it's toothless to have a UN peacekeeping troop, I think.
Thank you. Bring in Paul on this. Paul, that's a very good point. It's all extremely vague right now.
Yes, but it comes out of a situation which, as we've just heard, is very uncertain for the future of NATO. NATO has relied upon US backstop, and we cannot rely on a US backstop now. It throws open a whole host of questions, of which a European army is just one small part of. Yes, I think it is a positive move for the Europeans to be thinking about stepping up and collaborating. It makes a lot of sense. And that needs to happen independently of the US, quite clearly, because of where Trump is. But I think that a lot of this talk about ratcheting up defense spending to 3%, 4%, even 5% is pie in the sky, frankly. I don't think the public has the support for that. And I think it's dangerous because why are we talking about this at a moment in time when Trump and Putin are sitting down talking about a ceasefire and a peaceful resolution of this war? I think we need to be looking at much more widespread solutions here than just pumping more money into a military solution.
Stuart, to you, the UK will be heavily involved, whatever happens, I'm guessing. Starmer's defence of Ukraine is steadfast, as he has said the UK will be behind Ukraine for 100 years. That's how much support the UK government has pledged. So my question to you is, what kind of state of readiness are British troops in right now, and what could they offer?
Well, the quick answer to that is that the British Army in particular can't really offer very much. Such has been the denigration and downgrading of resourcing of all three services, but particularly the Army, that we would, if we were asked to go to war tomorrow, we would be hard pressed to put a brigade, and that's about between 3,500 and 5,000 personnel, depending how it's constituted, into the field without a huge amount of difficulty. So while Sir Keir Starmer's words are bold and reassuring for Ukraine and probably very welcome by Zelensky and his government in Kyiv, what we could actually do is very questionable. And if I just may pick up on the point of the percentage of GDP to be spent on defense budgets, that's not the way to go about designing armed forces for any particular purpose. They have to be designed to meet any particular risk or threat, and not just by throwing money at it willy-nilly.
So who do you blame for all this underinvestment in your military then, Stuart?
Well, successive British governments of both hues, both Conservative and now Labour, and also the senior hierarchy and management of our armed forces, who've been very timid in standing up to their political masters, particularly the Treasury, and saying this can't be done. And I can't remember the last time that a chief of the Defence Staff, or indeed a chief of any of the three services, resigned over a point of principle. And they must be telling politicians that the politicians are making pledges which the armed forces cannot physically deliver. But I suspect they're not doing that.
Gunilla, President Zelensky says he wants upwards of 110,000 troops to come in as peacekeepers. I mean, it's a very long border with Russia. He's not going to get what he wants on this either, is he?
No, but he has facing himself 600,000 Russian troops on the other side. So I understand he's asking for this, but it does not look very realistic. We're talking today about maybe 30,000, and they might not even be in Ukraine, but could be placed on the borders or be functioning in to have drones, for example, or to have other kind of control over Ukrainian cities to see what is happening. But inside Ukraine, it's far from sure. The other issue is that we don't know these troops, if they were there, under what command. They're not going to be under NATO command. And that means if there is a breakout or if there is actually fighting on the front line, these countries, Sweden, France, UK, will have to fend for themselves. And is there an appetite? Is there a readiness for this?
Paul, to you, could this function as a subset of NATO? That it would be an umbrella organisation, but ultimately each country would be responsible for their own?
Well, it certainly could. There's the capacity for that to be developed. And there have been a number of different models that have been floated over the years, in fact decades, led principally by the French. The Germans have been also thinking about a separate European arm within NATO. And I would imagine that this current administration would be more supportive than previously. The language coming out of Washington is the Europeans need to step up. So I can't see them opposing this sort of conversation in the way that American administrations have been at best ambiguous in the past, because they've been very cautious about losing influence within Europe and within NATO. And of course, the NATO military command has always been underneath an American. So there'd have to be some kind of an independent political governance structure that governs the European army. Otherwise, they're just answerable to the Americans still.
How much do you think President Trump's return has sharpened European minds on this?
How long's a piece of string? Massively. I mean, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this were it not for Trump. I think if Kamala Harris had won the election, then we would probably still be in the same conversation as we were a year or two ago. But Trump has changed the world, and all of us, whatever our political beliefs or nationalities, need to wake up to these massive shifts and think creatively about how we engage. This is a world that will be dominated by a transactionalist approach. It's quite likely that the United States will be looking to sue for peace with both Russia and, I would say, also China, looking for deals, looking for massive reductions in military spending. The Trump administration has announced the intention to reduce defense spending by 8% every year for its term of office. These are big shifts, and I think there are opportunities here as well as concerns and worries.
Stuart, to you, why didn't Europe see this coming? I mean, we've known President Trump, his rhetoric for a very long time. It seems a lot of European countries have been caught out very quickly.
Yes, I think that's the case, and it's very much a case, I would suggest, of cognitive dissonance. We were all aware from President Trump's first period in the White House that he was constantly banging on about how Europe was going to have to take a more significant share of its own defense and military. And therefore, it should have come as no surprise that in his second term of office, he's returned to that theme. The problem is that European countries, many of them anyway, have been hoping that the so-called peace dividend following the end of the Warsaw Pact and the coming down of the Berlin Wall would continue ad infinitum. And in fact, in Britain, Boris Johnson said the days of massed tank assaults in Europe are over and gone, and the British military hierarchy felt the same way. Well, they were wrong. And so we shouldn't have been taken by surprise, but we have been. And now we're trying to play catch up. But we're going to have to do it very quickly to get ourselves in a position where European nations can resist any future Russian attack without the United States being on side.
Gunilla, which country do you think will step up the most and lead? I mean, Keir Starmer is flexing his muscles, traveling to Washington, D.C. to see President Trump. I mean, is there an opportunity here for the United Kingdom to lead?
Could be. I think France will have an important role. I think the Nordic countries, I don't know, perhaps we would see Finland, perhaps we would see also the Baltic states, even though they're small, because there is a big worry now, especially in the Nordic region and Baltic states, since there was a report from the Danish intelligence service the other day with 3 scenarios, what can happen if the Ukraine conflict is stops or is frozen. And one is that within 6 months, Russia will be able to wage a local war with the bordering country. Within 2 years, it could launch a regional war in the Baltic Sea region. And in 5 years, it could launch a large-scale attack on Europe if the US is not involved. This sounds very dramatic, but people, countries, and governments are being scared of these kind of reports. So I think there might be more of a willingness as time moves on. We have to see what happens with Russia and with Putin and Trump now. But we have to somehow give security guarantees to Ukraine. They need it. They deserve it. They must have it.
Paul, it begs the question, are we now in a phase of pre-war preparation?
I think it's quite probable that we are, and I think that's deeply unfortunate. Deeply unfortunate. The scenarios that are being discussed are worst-case scenarios, and it is inevitable that those responsible for defence take worst-case scenarios. But we have to look in the bigger picture, and it's very easy to slide into arms racing, into demonising binary approaches, us versus them. Assuming that that people will be bad means that they're more likely to be so, because they see us building up our capacity to respond to them. And you know, we could be sitting here in Moscow having similar conversations about how NATO is rearming and building up its capacity. And we need to have these conversations that Trump and Putin are having. I strongly welcome them. I also strongly welcome Trump's imaginative proposals for nuclear disarmament, which we've not seen since President Obama.
So you've no concerns about Trump reaching out to Putin and offering the hand of friendship after everything?
I have significant concerns, but I think they are overwhelmed by the fact that he is talking about ending the war, and he is talking about trying to build a bridge for dialogue, which frankly is essential given where we are at as a global society, the way in which we have to pull together and do things that Trump doesn't want to do, like tackle climate change and other essential global catastrophic risks that are running head forward towards us right now. And we need global cooperation with people, with states that we find difficult to cooperate with. So I hope that this can usher in a new, more cooperative approach across boundaries that are very, very difficult to reach across.
Stuart, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, is on record this past week as saying no foreign troops will be tolerated in Ukraine, no foreign flags, they're on their own. So ultimately, even if Europe gets its act together and gets this big fighting force to keep the peace, nothing much can happen without the Russians say so, according to what we're hearing.
Well, I mean, if you're going to be bullied by the Russians into what sovereign nations can and can't do by putting troops into other sovereign nations, then yes, it's going to be difficult. But I think we need to sort of, get ourselves sorted out and stand up to the Russians. Lavrov has got absolutely no right to say that whatsoever. And I think we just have to call the Russians bluff. How many times has Putin rattled the nuclear saber, for example, over the past 3 years? And every time he's backed down. The Russians are bullies. We need to stand up to them and say, yes, we are going to send NATO troops into Ukraine if that's what's decided, and then see what they do about it. And I bet they don't want to do anything about it whatsoever except complain bitterly.
Gunilla, that's a good point, isn't it? I mean, Europe needs to show some strength here, or else we will be doing this again 18 months down the line, if not sooner.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that's what is happening now behind the scenes. Slowly, Europe is coming together and realizing we have to do this on our own. We can't rely on the US. we have to do this and we have to protect Ukraine because we are protecting ourselves too. Then the problem is that Europe is still divided. We have Hungary, we have Slovakia, we have an election coming up in Germany. It's still a big rift between countries on the view on Ukraine and Russia in Europe. This is a challenge, but I do think that Europe is going to get their act together. We were shell shocked by what Trump has said and Trump and Putin's talk, and maybe that's what we needed.
Paul, to you, in terms of a peacekeeping force, would you worry that mission creep might set in? Because people like certainty, and this aggression between Russia and Ukraine has been going on centuries.
Sure. I mean, there are always risks. Every approach here carries risk, and putting in a peacekeeping force, particularly ones that are from nuclear weapon states, involve the potential for a nuclear weapon state facing off against another nuclear weapon state. This is one reason, I think, why we do need to think more imaginatively and consider solutions that go beyond Europe. Not necessarily having the peacekeeping forces completely non-European, but certainly having a number of non-Europeans involved. We have the Saudis involved in brokering talks between the US and Russia. These are new times where it's not just the post-colonial states that have control over the mediation and the conflict resolution. Why don't we invite other countries from other parts of the world to play a role here? Countries that have just as much experience in peacekeeping as Europeans have had. In fact, most of the UN peacekeeping forces come from non-European countries.
Stuart, do you think that might be more acceptable to the Russians if peacekeepers came from perhaps outside Europe? I don't know how it would be funded, but would that be an acceptable compromise?
Well, I think it might well be. And I mean, I've taken part in UN peacekeeping operations. And certain countries are very good at UN peacekeeping. The Canadians spring to mind, who've got a huge experience in it, and the Irish. But it might be more acceptable to the Putin regime if any peacekeeping force, which was introduced to Ukraine, came from a non-NATO country. Whether that would be acceptable to the rest of Europe is another question altogether. And of course, a lot of the nations that do participate in UN peacekeeping operations do so because the UN pays for them. And it's a handy source of revenue if you're a country that's struggling with the economy. But going back to your point, I think that it might be more acceptable, for example, to have African countries or Asian countries providing peacekeeping troops than it might be to have Brits or Germans or Canadians on the dividing line.
Gunilla, is there a concern that if a peacekeeping soldier were to be injured or, God forbid, killed by a stray Russian missile or a bullet, that we see an escalation of a conflict? I mean, this is a very, very worrying time.
Yes, you're right. And the risk is there. Peacekeeping troops it could be very sensitive to have them because they would be stuck in a conflict and then maybe they cannot be stuck when it actually breaks out the conflict and they will be killed. And then how would the government react? Would we pull back the troops? Would we go into a wider war? This is a worry. When we talk about peacekeeping troops, this is on everyone's mind. What happens if things fall apart, basically? What are we going to do? Will we stay or will we pull back?
Paul, to you, I mean, whatever happens in the next weeks and months, it's clear that something is needed to keep that peace between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, this is going to be a long-term commitment for everyone. Is there that appetite to fund it, back it, and come together in Europe?
Well, I hope so, because providing peacekeeping forces over a long period is still a lot cheaper than the money that we've been spending on the war up to now. And that's just the financial dimension. The damage of this war has been enormous. The deaths have been tremendous. And the economic impact across Europe, in the US and Russia, has been massive. So this is a very cheap solution if we are looking at the overall costs. And we do need, there is no alternative other than continuing this war. There's no solution that I've ever seen that doesn't involve some kind of a line of control and some kind of a policing operation, which is going to cost money. So I would think that there should be a pretty strong case to be made to Trump that this is his cheapest solution.
Stuart, just on that point, I mean, a lot of Europeans don't like Trump. They don't like the rhetoric. They don't like his bluntness and his language. But do you think he's doing Europe a favour here, sharpening minds in a very short space of time?
To a certain extent, yes. I think that the fact that he has been so extreme in his views and pronouncements on America, withdrawing some of its support, etc., from European countries, has concentrated minds, and that is probably a good thing. But if he carries through with it, then we're looking at something which is not such a good thing. But the point I would make about all of this, we could talk about EU armies and we could talk about peacekeeping forces, but the first thing that has to happen is the fighting has to stop, because you can't put in peacekeeping forces to keep a peace that doesn't exist. And so if Trump is successful in his efforts in bringing about a negotiated peace which satisfies both warring parties, then I think that would be a very important first step in getting Europe back on an even keel again.
Stuart, Gunilla and Paul Ingram here in the studio with me. Thank you all so much for your contribution on this roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.